Look at the Middle East today, and you are looking at what appears to be the undisputed centre of future global power. In the deserts of Saudi Arabia, a $1 trillion megacity is being carved out of the sand, funded by a sovereign wealth fund so massive it is outright buying global sports leagues, dominating international real estate, and absorbing Western technology sectors. Just to the north, Iran regularly parades advanced ballistic missiles through the streets of Tehran, projecting military reach across multiple time zones and funding highly organised proxy armies that have repeatedly dragged the United States military into unwinnable desert entanglements. If you consume standard geopolitical news, the narrative presented to you is perfectly clear. The Middle East holds the world hostage. On paper, this region possesses the ultimate cocktail for superpower status: infinite capital, complete control over global energy choke points, rapidly growing youth populations, and absolute monarchies or theocracies that do not have to worry about the messy, slow bureaucracy of Western democracies. They can plan decades in advance with unlimited budgets. It looks like an unstoppable rise. It looks like a region preparing to dictate the terms of the 21st century. But this image is a masterpiece of geopolitical marketing. It is a terrifyingly fragile mirage. The truth, the structural, mathematical reality that the daily news cycle completely misses, is that no nation in the Middle East will ever become a true global superpower. They will never dictate the future of the global order. They will never replace the United States, and they will never rival a unified industrial giant like China. In fact, the very resource that created their spectacular wealth, the oil that built the glass skyscrapers and funded the futuristic mega projects, is exactly what guarantees their permanent structural collapse. Beneath the $1 trillion sovereign wealth funds lies a fundamentally broken economic engine. It is a system mathematically doomed by a devastating demographic time bomb, locked inside an inescapable geographic shatterbelt and suffocated by the absolute absence of the one physical resource required to build a true self-sustaining economy. This is not a story about religion, ideology, or daily political conflict. This is the story of how infinite cash destroys national capacity. This is why the Middle Eastern superpower is an illusion. To understand why the Middle East is fundamentally trapped, we first have to completely redefine what it means to be a global power. We have been conditioned to confuse cash with capacity. A true superpower builds dominance by engineering a highly productive, technologically advanced, and relentlessly efficient domestic workforce. They produce complex goods that the rest of the world is forced to buy. But more importantly, a true superpower taxes its own citizens. Taxation is the engine of state building. When a government relies on its citizens for revenue, it is forced to build complex, highly functional institutions. It must build advanced legal systems to protect property rights, rigorous educational pipelines to increase the value of labour, and a social contract where the government is directly accountable to the productivity of its people. The Middle East operates on a completely different and mathematically fatal economic equation. It is built entirely on the model of the rentier state. As outlined by the economist Hazem Beblawi, a rentier state is a nation where the vast majority of government revenue comes from external rent, specifically the sale of a single natural resource to foreign buyers. In a rentier state, the government does not need its citizens to generate wealth. The state simply pulls hydrocarbons out of the sand, sells them to the West or to Asia, and then distributes a portion of that cash downward to the population. On the surface, this sounds like a utopian economic cheat code. In reality, it is a structural death sentence. Because these governments simply sell oil and hand out the cash, they never had to heavily tax their citizens. And without taxation, the social contract is completely reversed. The state does not rely on the people. The people are entirely dependent on the state. This severs the link between hard work, innovation, and economic survival. The government never has to build the complex, resilient institutions required of a global empire because it can simply buy compliance. But what happens to a society when its government has infinite cash, but its citizens produce absolutely nothing of structural value? You get the phantom economy. To maintain political control and keep the population happy, rentier states must distribute their oil wealth. They do this by inventing millions of comfortable, high-paying, but entirely unproductive public sector jobs. In many of these Gulf nations, the vast majority of the native workforce is employed by the government, pushing papers in bloated bureaucracies that exist solely as a mechanism to hand out oil subsidies. This creates an economic catastrophe. It destroys the domestic incentive to industrialize. Why would a young citizen take the massive financial risk of starting a complex manufacturing business or endure the grueling labor of engineering when the state guarantees them a lucrative administrative job for life? They would not, and they do not, because the native population is absorbed into this state-funded phantom economy, the actual physical labour required to run the country. The construction, the engineering, the medical care, the sanitation must be outsourced. This forces these nations to rely on millions of imported, low-wage foreign workers. This is the brutal contradiction of the Middle Eastern model. You cannot be a global dominant force if your own citizens do not know how to maintain their own infrastructure. You cannot project dominance across the world when your domestic population is effectively helpless without a government oil check and a massive underclass of imported labour doing the actual work. Infinite cash means absolutely nothing if your society has forgotten how to build, maintain, and innovate. The oil wealth did not buy them a path to superpower status. It bought them a population of state-sponsored dependence. And as we are about to see, when you combine this phantom economy with the region's rapidly shifting demographics, this dependency turns into a mathematical time bomb. The rentier state model is a slow-acting economic poison, but on its own, a wealthy nation could theoretically sustain it for a century. To truly understand why the Middle East is facing an imminent structural wall, we have to look at how this broken economic engine is colliding with a terrifying physical reality. The first of these limits is human. It is the demographic trap. If you look at the population distribution across the Middle East and North Africa, you will see one of the most extreme demographic imbalances on the planet. It is defined by a massive, unprecedented youth bulge. In major regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran, roughly 60% of the entire population is under the age of 30. In a standard, structurally sound economy, a massive generation of young people is the ultimate geopolitical weapon. It is known as a demographic dividend. It is the raw human fuel required for rapid industrialization, technological innovation, and explosive GDP growth. When you have a booming youth population, you have a massive pool of cheap, energetic labour ready to build factories, lay infrastructure, and consume domestic products. But in a rentier state, a youth bulge is not a dividend. It is a mathematical time bomb. Because these economies are built almost entirely around the extraction and exportation of hydrocarbons, they face a brutal, inescapable paradox. Pumping oil and refining natural gas is a highly capital-intensive industry, but it is not a labour-intensive industry. You need billions of dollars in advanced drilling equipment, pipelines, and refinery infrastructure, but you only need a tiny, highly specialised fraction of the population to actually operate it. The primary economic engine of the Middle East produces astronomical GDP figures, but it produces virtually zero jobs relative to the size of the population. So, what does a government do with tens of millions of young, able-bodied citizens when its only real industry does not need them, and it has not built a complex manufacturing base to employ them? But the math has finally, violently caught up with them. Populations compound, oil fields do not. In 1970, Saudi Arabia had a population of roughly 6 million people. The state had more than enough oil revenue to guarantee every single citizen a lucrative public sector job, free healthcare, and subsidized housing. Today, That population is approaching 37 million. Iran's population has surged past 88 million. Millions of new citizens are entering the workforce every single year. The state can no longer afford the illusion. The government simply do not have the oil revenue required to hire millions of new graduates into the public sector. This has created a catastrophic education to unemployment pipeline. These nations have spent the last 2 decades using their oil wealth to heavily educate their youth, sending them to universities and exposing them to global living standards. But when these students graduate, there is no private sector to hire them. The state-sponsored jobs their parents enjoyed are gone. This creates a massive, highly educated and completely idle workforce. And in geopolitics, there is nothing more dangerous to a ruling government than millions of young men with university degrees and absolutely no economic future. When Western media analysed the Arab Spring, they largely framed it as a sudden ideological awakening, a regional desire for Western-style democracy. But if you look at the data, the Arab Spring was not an ideological revolution. It was a structural macroeconomic failure. It was the exact moment the rentier state model ran out of money to buy off its youth bulge. The social contract broke. This is a structural equation that guarantees perpetual internal instability. When your economy cannot employ your massive youth population, you are trapped in a cycle of domestic suppression, cyclical revolutions, and a constant exhausting drain on state resources just to maintain basic civil order. A nation cannot project power across the globe when its absolute top priority, day in and day out, is simply preventing its own youth from burning down the capital. You cannot build an empire when you are fighting a permanent demographic war at home. Even if these nations could somehow magically solve their demographic crises, and even if they could safely transition their phantom economies into productive labour forces, they immediately slam into the second, immovable wall. The physical geography of the Middle East itself. There is a fundamental, unbreakable law of geopolitics. To become a global superpower, a nation must first completely dominate its own home region. You cannot project economic and military power across the oceans if you are constantly fighting for your life on your own borders. The geography of the Middle East structurally prevents any single nation from ever achieving this regional dominance. When you look at a map of the region, you are looking at a classic geographic shatter belt. There is no unifying geographic feature. Instead, the region is defined by impassable physical barriers that guarantee division. Look at Iran. From a geographic standpoint, Iran is a fortress. It is surrounded on almost all sides by the towering, rugged peaks of the Zagros and Elburz mountain ranges. This geography is a brilliant defensive shield. It makes Iran nearly impossible to invade and occupy by a conventional land army. But fortresses work both ways. The exact same mountains that protect Tehran make it incredibly difficult and financially ruinous for Iran to project traditional military and economic power outward. You cannot easily march a massive mechanized land army out of the Zagros mountains to conquer and hold the vast plains of the Arab world. Iran is geographically contained. Now, look across the Persian Gulf at Saudi Arabia. Its geography is the exact opposite and equally limiting. Saudi Arabia is a vast, exposed, arid expanse. It has the sovereign wealth to buy the most advanced Western fighter jets, drones, and missile defense systems on the market, but it entirely lacks the internal geography. The internal waterlines, the arable land, and the natural defensive borders required to support a massive standing land-based military of its own. It is a geographically exposed state that physically cannot build an army capable of crossing the Gulf and penetrating the Iranian mountain citadel, because neither of the major regional powers possesses the geographic capacity to decisively defeat, occupy, and assimilate the other. They are trapped. They are locked into a permanent, mathematically unwinnable stalemate. This is the true structural reason behind the endless conflicts in the Middle East. The media often frames the Sunni-Shia split as purely a religious or ideological war, but beneath the theology, it is a geographic inevitability. When you cannot conquer your rival directly, you are forced to bleed them on the margins. You are forced into endless grinding proxy wars. This is why the battlegrounds of the Middle East are always in the fractured borderlands. In Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon. For a superpower, capital is used to build global influence, secure international trade routes, and develop next-generation technology. But in a geographic shatterbelt, capital is incinerated just to survive. Saudi Arabia and Iran are forced to burn hundreds of billions of dollars from their sovereign wealth funds simply to maintain the regional balance of power. They must constantly fund proxy militias, buy foreign weapons and subsidize fragile neighboring states just to ensure the other side does not gain an inch of ground. It is a geopolitical black hole. A superpower consolidates its neighbourhood to conquer the world. The Middle East is geographically designed to remain fractured, divided, and bleeding forever. But even if we strip away the demographic time bomb, and even if we ignore the geographic shatterbelt that locks them into endless proxy wars, there is a third, absolute, non-negotiable wall. It is a ceiling that has nothing to do with oil, mountains, or public sector jobs. It comes down to the single most important physical resource for economic complexity: fresh water. When the average person thinks about water scarcity, they think about it purely in terms of human survival, having enough water to drink, to bathe, and to sustain a population. But in macroeconomics and geopolitics, water is the absolute foundation of heavy industry. You cannot build a modern, complex superpower economy without astronomical amounts of cheap, naturally occurring, easily accessible fresh water. If you want to build a globally competitive steel industry, you need billions of gallons of water to cool the heavy machinery and process the raw materials. If you want to achieve the most basic requirement of national security, feeding your own workforce independently, you need massive, naturally occurring river systems to support large-scale agriculture. The Middle East is the most water-stressed region on the entire planet, outside of the Tigris and Euphrates, which are currently being dammed and choked off by Turkey at the source. The Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf possess virtually no permanent, navigable river systems. They have no massive freshwater lakes. They are attempting to build an industrial future on sand. To simply keep their rapidly growing populations alive, nations like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar rely almost entirely on desalination. They have built massive, sprawling industrial plants along the coastlines that suck in ocean water, boil it, and strip away the salt. Desalination is a marvel of modern engineering, but it is subject to the ruthless, unbreakable laws of thermodynamics. Boiling millions of gallons of ocean water every single day requires a staggering, almost incomprehensible amount of energy. This creates a terrifying structural paradox. These nations are forced to burn vast quantities of their own primary export, their oil and natural gas, just to manufacture the water required to keep their citizens alive. It is an economic suicide loop. They are cannibalizing their own wealth just to survive the desert. When you have to manufacture your own water at an exorbitant energy cost, heavy industrialization becomes mathematically impossible. If Saudi Arabia tries to build a domestic steel industry or a sprawling automotive manufacturing sector, the massive cost of artificially generating the water required for those factories is permanently baked into the price of their goods. It makes their products vastly more expensive and entirely uncompetitive compared to goods produced in North America, Europe, or Asia, where fresh water falls from the sky and flows freely through massive river networks for free. But the most glaring vulnerability is food. A global superpower cannot be reliant on its rivals for its daily calories, but because the Middle East lacks the water for large-scale, sustainable agriculture, nations in the Gulf import roughly 80 to 90% of their food. They are entirely dependent on global supply chains operating perfectly. If a major war breaks out in Europe, or if the United States Navy stops policing global shipping lanes, the Middle East starves. water scarcity acts as a permanent, unbreakable ceiling on their economic evolution. They can use their oil wealth to build luxury hotels in the desert. They can build massive financial centres and air-conditioned shopping malls, but they can never build the heavy industrial base required to dictate the global future, and they can never achieve true sovereign independence because the desert simply will not allow it. To understand exactly how the Middle East became locked into this inescapable structural trap, we have to look backward. We have to look at how the modern borders, the economies, and the very infrastructure of the region were actually constructed. In the early 20th century, the timeline fractured. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Daniel Yergin details in his definitive work, The Prize, the discovery of massive hydrocarbon reserves beneath the Middle Eastern desert coincided exactly with the rapid, explosive industrialization of the West. The British Empire, and shortly after, the United States, were transitioning their militaries, their navies, and their entire domestic economies to run on oil. To achieve and maintain global superpower status, the West required an infinite, uninterrupted supply of cheap energy, and they found the greatest reservoir in human history buried beneath the sand. This is the crucial historical inflection point, the sudden massive wave of infrastructure that was built across the Middle East in the mid-20th century. The deep water ports, the sprawling pipelines, the massive refineries was not built by Middle Eastern governments to develop their own nations. It was built by Western corporations backed by Western militaries strictly for the purpose of extraction. The West did not build that in the Middle East. They built a one-way street from the oil well directly to the seaport. The massive refineries was not built by Middle Eastern governments to develop their own nations. It was built by Western corporations backed by Western militaries strictly for the purpose of extraction. The West did not build that in the Middle East. They built a one-way street from the oil well directly to the seaport. This dynamic permanently rewired the destiny of the entire region. The sudden, astronomical influx of foreign capital meant that the ruling families of the Middle East never had to go through the painful, slow, and absolutely necessary process of organic state building. They did not have to figure out how to tax their populations. They did not have to build complex legal institutions to protect private property. They did not have to develop a technologically advanced, productive workforce. They simply became the global gas station. They were handed infinite wealth overnight, but in exchange they surrendered their structural independence. This created a permanent loop of dependency that still defines the region today. Because they never built a complex domestic economy, they are trapped in a perpetual cycle. They pump raw, unrefined crude oil, a low-complexity product, out of the ground and sell it to the West and to Asia. They then take that cash and use it to buy back high-complexity products, advanced technology, industrial machinery, pharmaceuticals, and military hardware from the exact same foreign powers. They do not produce their own fighter jets. They buy them from Washington and London. They do not invent their own advanced telecommunications networks. They buy them from Beijing. As we established, they do not even grow their own food. A superpower dictates the terms of global trade because it produces goods the world cannot live without while remaining self-sufficient at home. The Middle East is the exact opposite. They are structurally dependent on the very empires they claim to hold hostage. They are locked into a state of permanent subservience, relying entirely on foreign powers to buy their oil, and relying entirely on those same foreign powers to sell them the tools required for their own survival. When you pull all of these structural forces together, the phantom economy of the rentier state, the rapidly ticking demographic time bomb, the impassable geographic shatter belt, the absolute mathematical ceiling of water scarcity, and a century of foreign dependency, the future of the Middle East is no longer a mystery. It is a mathematical certainty. The illusion of infinite power is running headfirst into a brutal wall of finite resources. For the last 50 years, countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Gulf states have used their astronomical oil wealth to buy time. They used cash to mask their deep structural fragility. They paid for domestic peace with massive public sector salaries, subsidized housing, and free healthcare, while hiding their military weakness behind imported American and European defense systems. But the math is finally breaking down. Populations compound, oil fields do not. The sheer volume of oil these nations must pull out of the ground and sell just to meet their basic domestic budget requirements, just to keep their millions of unemployed youth from revolting, is rising to unsustainable levels. The core economic engine of the Middle East is cannibalizing itself. When you understand this structural math, the actions of the region's leaders suddenly make perfect sense. This is exactly why you are seeing a frantic, almost desperate push for trillion-dollar megaprojects like NEOM, or extreme, high-risk investments in global sports and Western tech companies. The media frames these projects as the confident, visionary expansions of an emerging superpower, but structural economics tells us a completely different story. These are the panicked, high-stakes gambles of nations that realize their core economic model is mathematically doomed. They know they have exactly one generation left to pivot before the money runs out. But you cannot pivot to a complex, industrialized, superpower economy in the middle of a desert when you lack the water, the unified geography, and the productive labor force to actually build it. It matters because the Middle East is the world's most dangerous geopolitical trap. For decades, Western audiences have been sold a comforting narrative that if we just find the right foreign policy, back the right leader, or broker the perfect peace deal, the Middle East will stabilize, modernize, and become a functional, independent pillar of the global order. The structural reality proves that this is a fantasy. The Middle East will never produce a superpower to rival the United States or a unified industrial giant like China, but it will also never be ignored, because it still holds the energy reserves required to keep the global industrial machine running. Actual superpowers will always be forced to intervene. The United States, Europe, and increasingly China will be permanently chained to this region. They will be forced to spend trillions of taxpayer dollars and deploy massive naval fleets simply to ensure the oil keeps flowing through the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. They will constantly be dragged into the geographic shatter belt, forced to manage the endless proxy wars between nations that have the cash to buy advanced weapons, but lack the structural capacity to ever win a decisive victory. The Middle East will not conquer the world. It will remain a permanent geopolitical black hole. It is a region of spectacular, blinding wealth and catastrophic, inescapable fragility. It is guaranteed by its own geography and its own economics to remain fractured, dependent, and volatile forever. I am Mr. Moore, and this is The Economy Historian. Thanks for watching. Next time, we leave the Middle East and head west to break down the massive economic engine of California. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.